Happy New Year and welcome back to my channel. I wish you all a safe, healthy, and prosperous 2021 to come. And thank you so much for joining me. Today I'm going to be looking back on 2020, all the books that I read. I read 49 books and I was just one book off my reading goal. I was in the middle of reading Mistborn on December 31st and I just didn't finish it. I spent some time with family. And you know what? I don't really care about reading goals all that much. I am still incredibly happy with all the books that I read. I would call 2020 a very successful year of reading. I read so many great books, which is why this list is a top 10, but it's not really going to be ranked. And I decided that it didn't make sense to compare a lot of these books because they're so different in what they were trying to achieve. And instead, I'm just going to be doing sort of like superlatives, you know, like in your yearbook, you have superlatives. These are kind of my bookish superlatives for 2020. And thank you so much to everyone in my Discord who chimed in with some suggestions for categories. I also wanted to acknowledge that I recently hit 1,000 subscribers and welcome you all to my channel. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm so excited to keep making videos about books in 2021. I don't think I'll ever get tired of praising Rob and Hobb's characters, and in the last book of the Tawny Man trilogy, I think Hobb just outdid herself with the level of emotional investment that I had in this book, and just throughout the series there were so many moments that moved me to tears. And what really strikes me about these moments that made me cry were that they weren't always these huge climactic moments where, you know, the character sacrifices himself or something drastic like that. A lot of the times it was just simple dialogue between two characters that was just so heartfelt that it moved me to tears. And I think it speaks to Robin Hobb's ability to craft characters that feel real and human that I cried so much throughout this book. Specifically, Fool's Fate was just such a incredible emotional roller coaster. I can't recommend Hobb enough. For even as good as the Farseer trilogy was, I think her later work is even better. And so yeah, I am definitely looking forward to crying my eyes out as I read the Fitz and the Fool trilogy this year. Seasons of Alpedon is a deceptively simple read. At first, the story seems like it's a parochial fairy tale, but as I read, I realized that it was much more grounded in reality than I initially thought. The people who populate this world were heartbreaking and tragic, and the conflict at the heart of each of the four main characters was beautifully crafted. The theme of industrialization as a destructive force was heavily explored in this book to great effect. I was fascinated by the conflict between science and magic. Seasons of Alpedon is the best self-published fantasy book that I read in 2020, but also it was just a fantastic book. If I've realized anything this year, it's that self-published fantasy is full of hidden gems like this one, and I'm excited to find more of them in 2021. I was so excited about this debut novel that I actually pre-ordered it, and I don't really do that a lot. Even for books that I know I want to read, I usually wait a little bit to buy them, but for this book, for whatever reason, I decided to pre-order it, and I am so glad that I supported the author and did pre-order this book because it was such a beautiful novel and I loved the imagination that went into this world. I've read a lot of fantasy at this point in my life, and so it does take a little bit of effort on an author's part to make me feel that sense of wonder. I felt that in this book several times. There were scenes that were just so breathtaking and imaginative that I felt like a kid again reading this book. I loved Ellie as a protagonist, the titular character Elatsue. In particular, what I loved about this book was the theme of community as strength and family as strength, and I really enjoyed how much Ellie, the main character, relies on her parents and her friends to overcome this adversity. And I mentioned this in my review for Elatsue, but I hope that there are sequels because I could see this being sort of like a Dresden Files for young adults. The Way of Kings is a book that I don't think I was fully sold on until I read the last chapter. Even though I did enjoy it throughout, it was a great book in general, I think that the ending and the way that these characters come together was just so phenomenal. And obviously, due to the nature of endings, it's hard to be specific about why, and I made a whole spoilery video about The Way of Kings and why I think it's one of the most well-constructed books I've ever read. You know, it might not be the most well-written, but in its construction, I think that Sanderson did something really special. So on the other hand, we have the best beginning, and I'm gonna have to give it to Senlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft. I really love the way this book starts off because Senlin himself is kind of like this newcomer in this very foreign territory, and it's basically about Senlin and his wife. They go on this honeymoon, and almost as soon as they arrive at their destination, which is the Tower of Babel, Senlin's wife gets lost. The rest of the book just follows him as he tries to find her again. The beginning of this book is so wonderful because it perfectly captures Senlin's character, and it also does such a great job of setting the stage for the rest of the book. Senlin Ascends was one of the few books I read this year that almost as soon as I started it, I was invested. In particular, I really appreciated this novel for the brevity that Bancroft employs, especially early on in this book. First sort of couple chapters of this book were so chaotic and weird, and just like Senlin, you have no idea what's going on. You're kind of panicking, and yeah, Senlin Ascends really surprised me. And I read a lot of really long fantasy books, and so whenever I read a short story, I'm always amazed by how much an author can do in such a small amount of space. No author has impressed me so much as Octavia E. Butler and her short story called Amnesty. I read an entire collection of her short stories called Bloodchild and Other Stories, but this one in particular really stood out to me, and it's hard to talk about it without spoiling it because it's so short, and I highly recommend all of the short stories in that collection, but this one is the one that I still think about to this day. I still think about it. I find myself pondering the questions that Butler brings up in that short story of what it means to be human, and how as humans we're so used to being at the top of the food chain, and what would happen if an alien species invaded and all of a sudden we had to be subservient. All of these questions just fascinate me, and I think it's just a testament to Butler as a writer that she's able to create such interesting dilemmas in such a small amount of space. And personally, I realized that I prefer my sci-fi in short story form. I think that when you get to the novel length, authors can get really bogged down in technical jargon, and just it can get kind of repetitive at times and dry. But in short story form, there's no room for that. You just have to get straight to the point and straight to the heart of the things. And I guess 2020 was kind of a year of extremes for me in that regard, because I either read really short stuff or really long stuff. Okay, so I can't talk about this romance directly because that would kind of spoil the plot, but Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon had one of the most sweetest, most tender romances that I read this year, and I wanted to give it a shout out. And the romance isn't even the focus of this novel, it's definitely a subplot, and the main plot was fantastic. I loved this book and its characters, and just in general, I think this book deserves all the kudos for the amount of ground that it's able to cover in 800 pages. Most fantasy authors choose series as the method of telling their stories just because it's hard to world build and cram all this stuff into one book, but Shannon does a pretty bang-up job of it, and I think it's a testament to how successful the author was in writing this book and telling the story that the romance is one of the best I've read this year, and it wasn't even the focus of the plot. The book that was most unexpectedly good for me this year was Riot Baby, and honestly, it's probably the most relevant book that I've read. I think that fantasy and sci-fi are inherently political genres. People who want fantasy and sci-fi to be removed from real-world politics. I think it's a little misguided. And whereas a lot of SFF will tend to have political subtext, Riot Baby is just more explicit in its political message, and I found that incredibly refreshing and relevant to 2020. And voices like Tochi Onyebuchi are the ones that I'm most interested in hearing from currently in the sci-fi fantasy genre, and I really hope that he continues to write adult SFF moving forward. The weirdest book I read this year was definitely My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. This book felt oddly relevant because it's about a woman who goes through a period of self-imposed isolation. She recently lost her parents and she's just dealing with all this grief. It follows this unnamed narrator as she just sleeps for a year. The book was set in the early 2000s. I would be really interested in Moshfegh, I don't know, writing a sequel or like a companion book that was set in 2020, because I think it would change the certain dynamics quite a bit, and just I would be so interested to see her take on like how social media would affect this isolation. This book was fascinating for its exploration of mental health. I don't know if it is a good portrayal of mental health and how to deal with mental health. The main character is definitely written to be an unlikable protagonist. And yeah, it was just like the weirdest book I read this year. And Moshfegh has a number of books that are equally as weird and kind of maybe even weirder. So hopefully I can get to some of those in 2021. And finally, 2020 was a lot of things, you know. I don't know about you guys, but I definitely cried a lot in 2020, so I wanted to end this video on a bit of an optimistic note. And so the book that made me laugh the most in 2020 was Weird Sisters by Terry Pratchett. I talk about this in I think it's my October wrap-up, but Terry Pratchett just has a way with words. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Where like literally every page there was something that made me at least smile, if not laugh a little bit. It's funny because I think it's so natural to Pratchett. His writing doesn't feel forced at all. It doesn't feel like he's trying to force these jokes into a space where they didn't fit. And that is the magic of Discworld, I think, is Pratchett's way with words and his jokes and his compassion for his characters. I really cherish every Discworld book I get because it's just such a fun time reading them. And recently I read a book that really reminded me of how good Terry Pratchett is, because I think the author was trying to do something similar where, you know, he was trying to be funny and like every other line was like something clever or like witty, and it just came off forced. I don't know how Pratchett does it, but he is just in a league of his own when it comes to fantasy that makes you smile, fantasy that gives you that sense of escapism and wonder. I love Terry Pratchett. And at the end of the day, I think that's all you can ask for is, you know, a little laughter and an escape from the mundane world. And so yeah, those were the books that I loved the most in 2020. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm trying to get better at just like talking to the camera instead of having a script. So let me know what you think. Thank you so much again for 1,000 subscribers, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.